Hi, folks. We are back with the Ancient History Jewelry Stories podcast for part 2 of this month's deep dive series, The History of Gold and Silver. This is the silver part of that series. On the last episode, we dove into the history of gold, a metal that's been driving people wild for longer than recorded history. This episode, we are going to get into the second most popular precious metal, silver, which, in many cases, has brought more wealth to empires and countries than gold ever did. If you haven't listened to the first episode, I do recommend you go back and listen to it. If not before this one, then at least after, for a broader idea of how precious metals have shaped our history. If you don't know what all of this ancient jewelry stuff is about, then you must be new here. Welcome. My name is Melise, and I'm a goldsmith trained in ancient techniques. I host a video series called Ancient History Jewelry Stories, where I present an alternate view into our collective history through the lens of jewelry, which I think is one of the most personal and important forms of art that humans create. Moving along with the boring stuff, the housekeeping and announcements. If you're a paid Patreon member, you'll be getting your first bonus video today. In fact, you've probably already gotten the notification email. It's an extra little tidbit about platinum, copper, bronze, and some of the other metals that go into jewelry fabrication. If you'd like to have access to this bonus video, as well as future monthly bonus videos, you can join the Patreon at the $5 a month tier at patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. Yes, that's right. I'm holding input for ransom at the cost of a fancy coffee drink every month. Support my latte habit, and you too can have a say in what content I make. Otherwise, I'm unable to take requests for videos because I have to get through the giant list I've made for myself first. For those of you watching my videos daily on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, I will be moving to a 5-day-a-week posting schedule starting this week. That's the week of June 26th for anyone listening in the future who doesn't have any idea what I'm talking about. It's been 6 months of daily videos and posts, which has been tremendous fun, but I'd like to be able to devote more time to making podcast episodes. It turns out that I like talking uninterrupted for 30 to 45 minutes at a time. Who knew? The ultimate goal is at least one podcast episode per week in the future. One last tidbit. Quite a few people responded to my poll on the last episode on Spotify, saying that they'd love to have merch, especially if we're shit-talking heinous historical figures. One person said they didn't want the merch and that I shouldn't curse, which frankly is hilarious, and it's my own fault for even including that as an option. I'm working on having some tote bags and mugs ready in time for the next episode in 2 weeks. And now that we've gotten the boring stuff out of the way, let's move on to the main event, the history of silver. In the last episode, I really tried to make a point of just how much humans love gold. It's driven entire civilizations, fueled more wars and bloodshed than any other commodity, and has been a coveted material for adornments and beautiful objects since the first human came across a glinting flake of gold in, let's assume it was a riverbed. Gold, of course, has a sibling in the precious metals world, silver. Where gold is warm, orangey yellow, glinting with the light of the rising or setting sun, silver is cool, gray-white, with the ethereal shimmer of a full moon. They are, visually, natural opposites, though they often occur together in the form of the naturally occurring alloy electrum. Go listen to the last episode for more information on electrum. Silver, like its sister metal gold, is an element, number 47 on the periodic table. Its symbol on the periodic table is Ag, coming from the Latin word for silver, argentium. This word itself is derived from the Proto-Indo-European word arge, meaning shiny and white, which is very fun to say. Silver is a tremendously conductive metal, exhibiting the highest electrical and thermal conductivity of any metal, even more than gold and copper. True to its name, it also displays the most reflectivity. Silver is part of what are known as the 7 metals of antiquity, something I haven't touched on till now. That list consists of silver, gold, copper, iron, tin, lead, and mercury. These are, essentially, the metals from which the entirety of the ancient world was built. Silver occurs naturally in abundance in the Earth's crust. There is far more of it than there is gold, but it's actually fairly rare in its pure form, which is called native silver. It is far more often found as part of other naturally occurring alloys like electrum. Interestingly, silver has antimicrobial and antibacterial properties, a characteristic which is shared with both gold and copper, two metals which often occur in tandem with silver. There is evidence that the ancient Greeks knew of this quality and used silver vessels to hold their drinking water supplies. The silver would keep bacteria from growing in the water, keeping it safe. Though silver is quite soft, malleable, and ductile, please refer back to the previous episode if you want an explanation of these terms. It is not as soft, malleable, or ductile as gold. And, much like gold, it is often alloyed with other metals to increase its hardness and durability, as pure silver is very soft. Most silver jewelry, adornments, and objects, including silverware, are made out of sterling silver, which is a mix of 92.5% pure silver and 7.5% copper. You will also find fine silver, which is 99.9% pure, coin silver, which is 90% pure, and 800 silver, which is 80% pure. Coin silver is most often encountered in, you guessed it, coinage, while 800 silver is most often found in vintage and antique jewelry and silverware. While silver does have impressive anti-corrosive properties, it is more reactive than gold, although that's not hard to accomplish because gold is non-reactive. That means that silver will corrode and degrade if it's exposed to certain elements and moisture levels. Because of this reactivity, supplies of pure native silver are actually rarer than gold. Before it was discovered that silver could be extracted from naturally occurring alloys like electrum, silver was actually more valuable and rarer than gold in ancient Egypt. It wasn't until around 1500 BCE, when Egyptians discovered that silver could be separated from gold in electrum using various natural mineral salts, that gold became the more valuable metal. Prior to that point, all silver in Egypt had to be imported from Anatolia and Greece. This led to their early belief that gold was the skin of the gods, while silver was the bones. The use of silver goes back to at least 5000 BCE, probably first found as alluvial deposits in rivers or native ore on the surface. There is evidence to suggest that the extraction of silver from lead was being practiced as far back as 3000 BCE in Asia Minor, which is regarded as the first commercial center of silver production in what is modern-day Turkey. Although silver production in India, China, and Japan was almost certainly as ancient, there is very little surviving information. Asia Minor provided the bulk of the silver being used in the ancient world from around 3000 BCE till about 1200 BCE, when silver production was moved to the Laurium mines in Greece. These mines were partially responsible for the growth of the city of Athens, due to their proximity. This was the major source of silver for the next millennium or so, when the center of silver production shifted once more to modern-day Spain. This was the source of silver for the majority of the Roman Empire. In fact, when the ancient Phoenicians first came to Spain, they found so much silver that they used it to weigh their anchors in place of lead. The stability of Roman currency relied heavily on the availability of silver from these mines, and we'll be getting into the stability of silver currency in a little bit. I do want to note, before I start this next section, that I am aware that Viking isn't quite the right name for the group of people I'm about to discuss. The word itself has various debated origins, and the right term would probably be Anglo-Scandinavian, though I really do like what the Slavs and the Byzantines called them, Varangians, which comes from sworn men, meaning that they had taken a vow of fealty. I'm going to continue using Viking in this episode because, based on my research, it is not a term rooted in racism or colonialism the way that the term Aztec is, and it is the most recognized term. The Celts and later Viking conquest also greatly influenced the use and production of silver throughout Europe, into the Middle Ages. With the fall of the Roman Empire, gold became rather scarce in Europe, leading silver to be the predominant metal used in jewelry, religious objects, and adornments. Around 800 CE, Viking conquest along the northern European coast resulted in large quantities of silver being brought back to Scandinavia. As a result, silversmiths flourished, and silver is still an important Scandinavian jewelry tradition. Fortunately for them, silver deposits were discovered in Sweden somewhere around the year 1000 CE. By the Middle Ages, silver production had moved to Central Europe, as the ancient Spanish mines had been emptied of their silver. During this time, silver was very important as currency in trade with China. Silver was scarce in China, but very highly prized, so European traders would pay with silver coinage, making the source of a lot of the silver used in China during this time European mines. This exchange of silver allowed many important goods to travel back to Europe over the famed Silk Road, such as, of course, silk, tea, gunpowder, and ceramics. The fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453 led to what can almost be considered a diaspora of lost technique, leading exiles from the now Ottoman-controlled lands to flee to Europe, bringing with them techniques and knowledge that had been forgotten over the last half a millennia or so. This ultimately contributed to a flourishing of phenomenally well-crafted silver jewelry and objects during the Renaissance. Not long after, with the discovery of the Americas and the absolutely batshit insane greed of the Spanish conquistadors, and Europe as a whole, both Central and South America became the largest producers of silver. In fact, Argentina gets its name from the abundance of silver ore that made up the majority of its mineral wealth. Remember? Argentium. We often associate the Spanish looting of the Americas with gold, but the amount of silver stolen from the Americas absolutely dwarfs the already massive pile of gold that was taken. By 1600, the Spanish treasure fleets had brought back over 25,000 tons of stolen silver. That's almost 250 times more than the amount of gold looted during the same period. On the Mesoamerican side of things, silver was also highly valued, but not as much as gold, jade, and turquoise. The Maya had no source of silver of their own, despite being the source of most of the gold used in Mesoamerica. In South America, silver had particular significance to the Inca, who believed it was derived from the tears of the moon goddess, Mamaquilla. At the Inca capital of Cusco, there was a beautiful temple dedicated to her covered with beaten sheets of silver. They also associated silver with their thunder god, Ilapa. As such, mines were considered sacred places and often included shrines. Another culture that truly mastered the use of silver, as well as complex metallurgy in general, are the Moche people of Peru. Their use of silver in combination with gold to create wonderful two-tone adornments was a reflection of the duality of the world, a coming together of dark and light, masculine and feminine, night and day. Unfortunately, as with the gold artifact stolen by the Spanish, the source of much of this silver was not ore or bullion taken from mines, but culturally and religiously significant artifacts taken by force and violence, often resulting in death, from the many indigenous cultures who existed in the Americas before the arrival of the Spanish. Everything would have been melted into bars before transport to Europe, resulting in the mass destruction of entire cultures' histories. The same was done with gold. It was convenient for the Spanish to melt everything into coins and bars for various reasons. The most obvious one was ease of transport, but another insidious justification was that it would erase whatever identifying factors could link the stolen artifacts back to their rightful owners. This is not the first or the last time that this would be done when stealing precious metals. Melting down objects to form the gold into bars and coins also made it easier to divide the spoils. Quite a significant portion of the gold mined in the Americas, specifically in Mexico, made its way straight to China for trade. On the last episode, I was able to break down a pretty good estimate of how much gold has been mined throughout human history by era. Silver, unfortunately, is a little bit harder to pin down. That's partially because silver extraction is often the byproduct of mining for other metals, such as copper, lead, and zinc. So during times when demand for those metals is higher, silver production is consequently higher as well. This incidental mining of silver is more difficult to document than mining for native silver or silver ore. There are various estimates, but I will be using information provided by the U.S. Geological Survey. Their best estimate is that throughout human history, 1.74 million metric tons of silver have been mined. The U.S. Geological Survey helpfully points out that this is the same weight as 5 pyramids of Khufu, or roughly 870,000 silverback gorillas. I swear we refuse to use normal points of reference for our systems of measurement in the United States. It's estimated that there are roughly 550,000 tons of silver left, though not all of it is accessible using modern mining technology. Out of all countries producing silver, Peru, Australia, China, and Poland are estimated to have the largest remaining reserves in that order. At our current rate of silver extraction, that leaves us with about 20 years of silver reserves, assuming mining continues at the same pace and an unknown source of silver isn't discovered. The largest producer of silver today is Mexico, followed by China and then Peru, though Mexico produces almost twice as much as China, providing about a quarter of the world's new silver supply. But wait! You remember me telling you last episode that gold is essentially indestructible and that most of what's been mined is still kicking around. Surely, the same must be true of silver? Actually, the reality is pretty sobering. Silver experts, and what a job title, estimate that about 90% of all of the silver ever mined has been lost to landfills. Landfills! Just thrown out with the trash. Entire cultures decimated for this shiny white metal just to have it end up with used diapers and plastic detergent bottles that will never degrade. I suppose humanity will have a chance to extract all of that discarded silver in our near certain dystopian future, where scarcity forces us to harvest resources from our landfills. Silver would, once again, be a byproduct of mining another material. One big reason why this happens is because silver, while relatively valuable, is nowhere near as valuable as gold. Today, as I record this, the global market shows gold at $2,332 per troy ounce. Silver, by contrast, is worth $29.26 per troy ounce. So, if you have always wondered why there is such a massive price difference between silver and gold, it's because, at least right now, gold is almost 80 times as expensive. This relationship between the price of gold and silver is known as the gold-silver ratio in the investment world, and in this case would be expressed as 80 to 1. It takes 80 ounces of silver to buy 1 ounce of gold. As I'm sure you can guess, this ratio can and does fluctuate. Throughout history, the ratio of silver to gold has actually been much smaller, with silver therefore holding much more value than it does today. Part of the reason for this is that, historically, governments have set this gold-silver ratio. In ancient Rome, it was set at 12 to 1. Remember those Spanish silver mines that were providing a consistent and steady supply of silver to the ancient Romans? In the 14th century in Venice, it dipped from just over 14 to 1 in 1305 to 10 to 1 in 1330. So, in 1330s Venice, you could buy an ounce of gold for only 10 ounces of silver. This doesn't mean that the gold got cheaper, but that the silver got more expensive. By the 1450s, it was back to 12 to 1. That's really not that much fluctuation. In Europe, France's loss of the Franco-Prussian War contributed greatly to the dwindling value of silver. France was forced to hand over 5 million francs worth of gold to the Prussians, and the Prussians used this money to form a unified Germany, then adopted gold as the standard for their currency. Before this, silver had been the standard for most currency. Many other European countries followed suit, and this caused over 3 million tons of silver to be dumped into the market in 6 short years. Silver coins ended up being demonetized and removed from circulation in order to avoid inflation. This, coupled with the fact that silver production was at an all-time high because of the Spanish in Mexico, meant that it lost value fast. In the United States, the gold-silver ratio was fixed at 15 to 1 with the Coinage Act of 1792. Because of the financial situation in Europe, the burgeoning U.S. government had to subsidize the American silver mining industry, the way we do with dairy and corn farmers today. The the government was purchasing $2 to $4 million of silver every month. Everything seemed stable-ish until President Eisenhower fixed the price of gold at $35 an ounce in 1934, which sent the ratio tumbling to 98 to 1. You needed 98 ounces of silver to buy 1 ounce of gold. Along with some other financial fuckery occurring in the United States throughout the 20th century, which I will not even pretend to understand, the value of silver continued to fluctuate, with an average ratio of 47 to 1 for the 20th century. In the first 3 decades of the 21st century, things have been fairly volatile, with a low of 35 to 1 in 2011 and an absurd peak of nearly 105 to 1 in 2020, a year when absolutely everything was shit. When it costs 105 ounces of silver to buy 1 ounce of gold, you can understand why it would be so undervalued as to end up in landfills. Now that I've confused everyone, including myself, with numbers, I'll throw in a more positive statistic. It's estimated that up to 30% of silver in use today is recycled. That number could stand to be much higher, and I suspect it will be, as the gold-silver ratio is sure to drop once more, eventually bringing the prices of both metals closer together. So, all this talk about the extraction and value of silver, but we haven't talked about its origins as a metal of value. Simply looking nice doesn't make a metal valuable. It has to be both abundant and rare. A paradox. A paradox which allows a resource like silver and gold to gain status as currency. If it weren't rare, it wouldn't have any value. And if it weren't also available in some quantity, there wouldn't be enough of it to be able to trade it. The oldest known silver currency dates back about as far as the oldest known silver mining, back to the 4th millennium BCE. The first use of silver as currency was likely not in coins, but in the form of rings, or by weight. It wasn't until around 600 BCE that the first silver coins show up. They are, in fact, one and the same as the first gold coins from the ancient kingdom of Lydia, because those coins were made out of electrum, a mix of gold and silver. I've talked some about the relative lack of ancient silver artifacts compared to gold. I do get asked quite often if I'm purposely leaving silver out of my videos and if I just focus on gold because I prefer it. That's absolutely not the case. Part of that is the exclusive status of gold throughout many ancient cultures, which led gold artifacts to be made for the sorts of people who were likely to have an elaborate burial, which ensured the safety of their golden goods. Recycling of silver may also account for some of this scarcity, as it was a metal that was more accessible to people who were not wildly wealthy, and they would have been more likely to reuse the material to create new jewelry, vessels, and adornments. Another issue is the general reactivity of silver compared to gold. If stored improperly, silver has the uncomfortable tendency to corrode. First, it oxidizes, which, in my opinion, is one of the more charming properties of silver. When exposed to sulfur, the surface of the metal will darken, often to a deep iron black, forming a layer of silver sulfide in pure silver or copper sulfide in sterling silver. This layer itself doesn't damage the silver, but exposure to sulfur can also form pits and fissures in the surface, a process which starts out slow, but it can be sped up exponentially with exposure to salts. Improperly stored silver, which is really any silver that is not stored in a dry, well-ventilated, sulfur-free environment, is going to eventually oxidize and, possibly, corrode. Okay, fine, you say. I'll stay away from sulfur. Sorry, it's the 3rd most abundant mineral in the human body, and if you're looking for the second half of the chemical reaction, we excrete salt when we sweat. If the human body can wreak this sort of havoc on silver, imagine what happens to it across a few thousand years, left in a humid tomb, or worse, exposed to salt air near the ocean. You're eventually left with an indistinct green, gray, or black blob, if you're left with anything at all. I mentioned in the last episode that gold was considered a noble metal, a non-reactive, non-corrosive metal, but that silver was sort of iffy. Some people grant it that status, others claim it doesn't qualify. This argument arises from the fact that, while silver is reactive, it is fairly resistant to corrosion if it isn't exposed to sulfur. The irony of that is that humans are sulfur-excreting creatures, so I, for one, don't count silver as a noble metal. I'm also not a chemist, so I don't think my particular opinion holds that much weight here. Feel free to make your own decision about whether or not silver is a noble metal. Let your heart guide you with this one. I think all of this history drives home why silver is such an important metal, easily as important as gold, if not more so, simply due to its accessibility. Silver has been the silent force behind many inventions we take for granted. The profusion of Central and South American silver flowing into Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries coincided with colonialism in India, and as such, increased trade with India. The simultaneous arrival of American silver and Indian diamonds led to a proliferation of diamond jewelry, as the shining white metal was the perfect material to enhance the sparkle of diamonds in candlelight. Silver was the material behind the first mass-produced jewelry, as it lends itself very well to cutting with presses and dies. This method, first invented in 1777, allowed components to be produced in bulk and then assembled together for a finished piece. The ease of construction, coupled with the relatively low price of silver as it was flowing almost endlessly into Europe, allowed this jewelry to be sold fairly cheaply. Of course, without silver, we may not have had photography. Starting in the 18th century in Europe, experiments were being conducted to prove that certain naturally occurring silver salts darkened when exposed to light. This property was eventually exploited to create the first photographic plates, which were coated with a silver nitrate solution. This would darken in all areas that were exposed to light, creating what we would now refer to as a negative. There was plenty of experimentation in the field of creating images with light, but the first surviving photograph wasn't taken until 1826. I won't go into the specifics of daguerreotypes and mercury vapors, or how photography evolved over the course of the next 2 centuries. That's a different branch of nerdery altogether, but it's safe to say that silver is one of the ancestors of the modern digital world. In terms of technique, silver is worked in almost exactly the same ways as gold. This includes granulation, filigree, chasing and repoussé, lost wax casting, and fabrication from sheet and wire. I covered those techniques in some detail in the last episode, so refer back to that if you want a refresher. In our modern world, aside from jewelry, silver is used mostly in electronics, given its high conductivity and resistance to corrosion. It's also used in medical applications because of its antimicrobial and mostly non-toxic nature. Pure silver is non-toxic to humans, but there are a few silver compounds that can be troublesome. I'm sure many of you have heard stories of people turning blue after taking too much colloidal silver. My favorite weird modern use of silver is cloud seeding, that freaky thing they do to create rain where rain isn't. I will leave you all with one last interesting bit about silver. In mythology, it is almost always associated with goodness and divinity, due to its association with the moon and lunar deities, who were most often women. It is also associated with the sacred feminine. Silver bullets were said to be able to kill supernatural creatures like werewolves and vampires, and the origin of vampires not being able to see their reflection in mirrors or show up on film is also rooted in silver myths. Mirrors were originally coated with a silver solution to create the reflective surface, and we just went over the whole silver photography thing. Early Christianity also did a really weird thing with this, as they do. Silver is believed to repel evil spirits, as it's a reminder of the betrayal and guilt of Judas, who sold out Jesus Christ for a measly 30 pieces of silver. The silver is seen as a reminder and symbol of that guilt and betrayal, which is supposed to repel the evil spirits, I guess. God bless the internet, because someone has had the same thought as me and done the math. Depending on the type of coinage they would have represented, those pieces of silver would be worth anywhere between $90 and $430 today. Or, consulting my handy ancient Roman conversion chart, with a gold-silver ratio of 12 to 1, it would buy you a quarter to 1.5 ounces of gold. Judas sold out for a pretty fucking measly amount of silver. And with that, we conclude the long and frankly fascinating history of silver. When viewed in conjunction with the history of gold, and copper, which I'll be touching on in the Patreon bonus video, it's fairly evident that silver has had a huge hand in shaping civilization since before our recorded history. One of the earliest metals used as currency, and the relatively stable standard by which currency was set for nearly 2,000 years. We've obviously mined so much of it out of the earth that we're reaching a point where we may be looking at a depletion of natural resources within this century. Chances are, a previously unknown source of silver will be discovered before then, but before you go tossing any old or broken silver jewelry, consider that terrifying 90% in a landfill statistic. While it may not hold much obvious value today, the fluctuating price and availability of silver almost guarantees that its value will rise again. Just look at the last few thousand years of history. The current relative lack of value compared to gold seems to be an anomaly. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did enjoy it, I would love it if you left me a rating and a review wherever you're listening to this. If you didn't love it, I'd prefer it if you kept that to yourself. If you'd like to watch my ancient history jewelry stories videos, you can find me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube under the username moonhoney.jewelry. If you want to see my own goldsmithing work and the jewelry that I make, you can find that at shopmoonhoney.com. And finally, if you'd like to have some input into the content that I make going forward, as well as enjoy a bonus video every month, you can join the $5 a month tier at patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. There is a free membership option, which you can definitely join, and which will hopefully have access to exclusive merch just for Patreon members in the future. But for now, there are no extras, except that it makes me happy to see people joining just to support this weird little project. Once again, thank you all for listening. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new topic, a new episode, and of course, more ancient history jewelry stories.